Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, the top 20 CIS controls and action guide to protect your organization. I'm Adam Beckman, Solutions Engineer here at Great Bay Software, and I have about 10 years of experience in the industry. In those 10 years, I've had the opportunity to work and become intimately familiar with security frameworks such as the top 20 controls and the technology and solutions that accompany them. So let's dive into the presentation. There was a culture shift not that long ago in how we approach risk mitigation. Back just a few years, it was all about removing as much potential risk as possible, no matter how low or how obscure the likeliness was. Today's approach has changed. Today's technology teams, it's more about mitigating the higher risk areas in order to grow the business. A line is drawn, if you will. Risk is calculated, and it falls on one of the two sides of the line. On one side, it'll get addressed, a control or technology will be put in place to mitigate it. And on the other side, it's not forgotten about, but it's watched, it's accepted. So it's considered a low risk. There may be partial controls put in place, but at the end of the day, it's not the same approach we had, 3, 4, 5 years ago. It's also very important not to lose sight of why we leverage cybersecurity tools and frameworks in our business. Nobody wants to be the next headline. Not only can a breach cause immediate financial loss, but the hit to your organization's reputation can cause lingering impacts from loss of customers or even fines from regulatory committees. Now, depending on your vertical, recent studies that I've read have shown churn rates from customers can be approached the 6% mark following a breach. Now, that's a revenue loss that most organizations do not want to endure. The CIS Top 20 Security Controls are a well-known framework. The version we're going to talk about today is version 6.1, released late August 2016. It is currently the current iteration that is out there. The top 20 have been around for quite some time. They were originally developed by SANS Institute, later turned over to the CIS organization to maintain and update on a regular basis. It's worth noting that version 7 is due out summer-ish of this year. Of course, that may change as reviews and stuff go on. But when it is released, Great Bay Software will be sure to provide some content informing you on what the differences are and what you need to know about the new version. So regardless of where you draw that line for calculated risk, there should always be 5 controls that fall on the included side of that line. The top 5 controls in the CSC framework are that foundation. They should be present in almost every organization that has a security policy and procedure in place. Now, depending on your environment and your needs, there may be, there of course will be additional items that you'll want to look at. I have a very ICS heavy background, so certain things like web and email wasn't important. So, Control 7, you just didn't have that because there was no web or email access from within a controls environment. However, again, conform it to your environments beyond this. But the bottom part of what we're going to focus on here is they really do, form that foundation for in any practice. When it comes to prioritized and foundational controls, none is more important than the device visibility and understanding what you have. Now, before I dive into the details of the first control, I want to explain kind of the slide layout, as it'll be consistent for the next 5 slides. On the right, you've got the red boxes. Those are, I broke those down and tried to as simple as I could, state the requirements within the controls, and I grouped them by the goal. So in CSC 1, there really are just 2 goals behind that control. The first is 100% visibility, knowing what is on your network and what is connected at all times. And then the second half of that control is the enforcement or control piece that only allows devices that are approved or authorized to connect, and those that are not, it prevents them from connecting or on your environment that'll alert or alarm or some course of action will take in when an unauthorized or rogue device is connected. So another recurring theme we've got through pretty much all the controls, but specifically these top 5, is the want to reduce the number of technologies in place. So whenever possible, you should consider trying to reduce the number of solutions you have to address a control. Now, very rarely will you be able to reduce that to one technology per control, but you should try to limit it as best as possible. Now, that'll vary based on your environment, based on the diversity of both technologies and devices that you have. For something like Control 1, I typically see anywhere from 2 to 3 deployed. Make sure that as your business grows, obviously IoT devices are becoming more and more prevalent. It's a trend that is pretty consistent across all verticals. So whenever security controls you plan to implement or security practices you plan to put in place, make sure you understand the ramifications around how the IoT devices will affect those security practices. In the form, when it comes to the context of the first control, a lot of the requirements, especially around enforcement, revolve around 802.1x or the more advanced certificate-based authentication, which a lot of folks know that 802.1x kind of is a certificate-based or plays really easily with certificates. That's not supported on a lot of IoT devices. So don't lose sight of the intent. The intent is to be able to control what connects to your network. There's other technologies out there, and depending on your ratio of IoT to traditional, you may want to consider the enforcement piece you have in place so that it works universally across your network. Also understand that this first control really lays a foundation for the rest of your security practices. Both 2 through 5 and even 6 through 20 rely very heavily on this first control. Because of that, you want to make sure you have as accurate visibility as possible. There's lots of ways to get visibility, right? You can do it through point-in-time scans. You can do it through real-time and continuous applications and technologies. Point-in-times are great and are useful in some situations, especially those you've got limited access to. They come with them some caveats and some dangers in certain environments, but nothing beats a real-time and continuous solution. So if possible, try to leverage that more passive real-time, something that monitors the switch information or leverages DHCP or other forms of stuff that is more of a real-time indicator of devices coming on and off the network. Moving on to the second control, it's nearly identical to the first one in that it has the same goals, visibility and enforcement, but it revolves around software. So again, the number of solutions you have in place, try to minimize. That may be a little trickier for both this control and for Control 3 because they deal with software, and software can be very varied in the environment. For instance, if you are Windows heavy but have Linux and Mac, BYOD style, it can be tricky to have solutions that operate universally on all of those. Make sure you leverage first control to know what you have. That's going to kind of drive your decisions for the software piece, discovering software. This one is also very important because it lays the foundation for a lot of further controls. Specifically CSC3, which revolves around secure configurations of software, as well as later on the backup and recovery piece that you need to know what software you have to know how and when to back it up. Now understand that some of the enforcement pieces here have some of the same challenges you have in the first control, in that they're not universal and they don't work across all environments. Whereas 802.1x doesn't always play very well with IoT devices or with networks that have a very high availability requirements, such as the industrial space. Whitelisting, which is kind of their equivalent call out here, is kind of in a similar situation. Whitelisting is the technology where you know what applications are installed and you only allow them to run. So if someone tries to install or execute some software that is not on a white list or an approved list of software, some process will kick in to prevent it from executing. That works great on some of your traditional systems like Windows and whatnot, but it can be very difficult or near impossible for some of your more IoT style devices. At the same time, it's not as much of a threat since a lot of their environments or a lot of their firmware and stuff is more closed and not difficult to install, and may even be locked down. So something to consider as you go through your inventory and figure out what you need to apply this to. One control that perhaps is more below the surface than any of the others is Control 3. So at first glance, it's pretty straightforward. It's, okay, I need to know what hardware, what software I have, and then I need to apply hardening to those systems and software to reduce the attack surface available to a bad actor. This can pose several challenges, and as you dig into it, there's a lot of layers you begin to peel back. One challenge, obviously, is the number of solutions you need to implement this. Again, based on the variety or the diversity of your network, you may not be able to just rely on group policy frameworks. You may have to look at the Linux solutions for distribution. What they have available, Mac or other network devices. Depending on the number of vendors you have, that you may have a number of solutions just to enforce hardening configurations. There is some overlap here with the second one, especially in the realm of file integrity monitoring. So most likely you'll already have, if you implement that for CSC2, you can hopefully leverage the same technology for CSC3. So make sure you're aware that that's an overlapping criteria when you assess and shop for a solution. Also, don't start from scratch when it comes to building hardened configurations. There's lots of industry standards out there. CIS, who obviously have provide us the top 20, they have several benchmarks as well. NIST has their equivalents in the form of checklists. Some IoT devices, especially in the biomed sector and vertical, have vendor and OEM recommendations where you can actually get configuration security suggestions from the vendor on what to apply and how to lock down. And typically they'll ship it to you pretty open for ease of use, and then it's up to you to go through and disable Telnet or FTP or the other functions, features that you don't want enabled. So make sure you are aware that that is the norm for a lot of those types of devices, and don't be shy about asking the vendor for any suggestions they may have. And then of course there's ISO standards, and STIGs are out there as well. You can find community-driven sites that have the technical implementation guides. Also, it's worth noting that in this control, keep in mind the balance between usability and security. I have been in environments where they harden their devices and systems so much that they actually make it difficult for some day-to-day routines and day-to-day procedures to take place, and so it really slows the efficiency of your workforce down. So make sure you kind of are aware of that balance as you define your secure configurations. The fourth control is focused on finding and remediating software vulnerabilities. This is one of my favorite controls, just because it's a lot of fun to start looking at the scans and it really brings to light some of the immediate hackable issues on your system. So as a certified ethical hacker, I always enjoy running the scans, finding the weaknesses, and then exploiting them. And a lot of times, this is an immediate answer to that action. Again, it's a recurring theme about reducing the number of solutions, but particular in this one, you can usually get away with maybe 2 solutions. Again, based on the diversity of your environment. Most commercial grade vulnerability scanners already align with risk rating systems such as CVSS. So that by itself, and they use a lot of the built-in functionalities such as the being able to compare one scan to another, credentialed scans, etc. So a lot of these items, or a lot of the sub-controls within this one, can be addressed just with that one solution alone. And usually those scanners are pretty vendor agnostic, so they work well across any number of device types, whether it's IoT, Windows, Linux, Mac, etc. One thing that I do want to draw your attention to, kind of on that usability side that I spoke to on the last control, is some environments, again, having a very heavy ICS background, some environments are very, very, scared is not the right word, very cautious about running scans, active scans in their environment. You know, in healthcare, you've got patient safety to keep in mind of. In ICS, you've got the reliability of the physical process that's running. Active scans can cause issues in certain environments. So make sure that when you deploy the strategy, you do it in such a way to take into account all the factors within your environment and all the requirements of both availability and safety. And also on that same note, make sure that as you mitigate the vulnerabilities that are found, you have some due diligence in testing the patches for compatibility and side effects. In the ICS space, there's entire patch cycles that are dedicated to offline or segmented equipment or in lab equipment to make sure that everything behaves the way it should before you roll out. So it's a real staggered rollout. It takes a little longer, but it's more cautious. So keep in mind the requirements that you have and make sure you have a patch rollout, a patch testing program that kind of fits those needs. The last of the foundational controls aims to protect and save against administrative accounts becoming compromised. This is, within the top 5, this one has the least amount of overlap, which kind of makes it unique. It doesn't really rely on many other controls other than 1 and 2. In other words, if we're looking forward, there's no control that looks back at Control 5 as part of its of what you need to consider when you implement it. The only exception is probably the last one, the red team, blue team exercise, as anytime you perform penetration testing or even a mock hacking scenario, user accounts and admin accounts will come into play. So that's, you know, whether it's cracking a password or trying to test user credentials on a network, that's the only time that you'll look back at this. Another thing to call out here is there's some references to leveraging centralized logging, or a SIM. It's kind of, when anyone says centralized logging, most people think of a SIM. That's not necessarily has to be the case, but in today's time, it for the most part is. A SIM is not required to do this, but it is part of CIS 6, which is just outside the top 5. So something to consider is maybe a next step, or look at what you have and look forward to 6 to see if you need to leverage that to address some of 5 here. But when it comes to looking at your environment and implementing the control of that administrative privileges, bear in mind the diversity of your network. So again, going back looking at CIS 1, that 100% visibility that you have, you should know what types of devices are on your network. And if I was a betting man, I would wager that a good chunk of those devices don't have the same password requirements or password settings available to them. And what I mean by that is some devices, again, more in your IoT embedded device world, will have, you know, some may allow special characters. Another may allow different sets of special characters. Some may not allow you to go past 8 characters. Some may require 8 characters. So the complexity within the password rules is going to vary from device to device. So make sure you're aware of that and take that into consideration as you write your policies and procedures and document your devices. Another thing to keep in mind is the escalation requirements within this control. So one of the sub controls is that you don't use administrative rights where it's for normal logins. Instead, you log in as a non-admin, and then you run like a run as command in Windows or a sudo command in Linux to escalate your privilege up to the next level and then perform your administrative functions. And of course, you know, I didn't really see too many of the advanced cases or the advanced subcontrols in the previous CIS, but this one is no different. It has an advanced control that is the dedicated machinery or dedicated machine to access or administer devices or to log into the administrator to manage other devices through an administrative function. That can be very cost prohibitive in very diverse environments where you may need more than one machine to administer from. So keep that in mind as you go through this. It's also worth mentioning, again, that there's a lot of overlap and crossover between the different CSCs. And so what we're representing in this graph is, or this chart, this table, is a list of every control in the, in the vertical. Every row is a different control, and then every column from 1 to 20 shows marked if there's a dependency or some type of overlap between those controls. Now, the first thing you'll notice is that control 1 is referenced or has the most overlap of all the controls. That makes sense since it's the highest priority control. Control 2, control 3 have a significant amount, and then control 6 has quite a bit. As I mentioned earlier, control 6 is that SIM requirement or the centralized login requirement. Looking ahead a little bit here, you've got control 8, control 12 kind of has some overlap. Control 8's malware, such as antivirus and whatnot, and it relies on some perimeter detection since you want to do certain functionality at the perimeter when it comes to malware. Beyond that, it's worth noting that, again, control 1, control 2 have the most overlap and therefore have the highest priority. So if you're looking for more information on cybersecurity strategies, information and best practices, please check out our website. You'll find content such as white papers, research briefs, ebooks, or plenty of other resources that are available to you as you work through your security strategies and staying up to date with technology trends. Thank you for tuning in. I hope you found it valuable. If you have any questions, please reach out to me directly. My email address is abackman@greatbasesoftware.com, or feel free to call me on my direct line listed there. You can also reach out to the sales team if you have any sales-related questions. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.